Good afternoon. My name is Jack Marsh, along with my friend and longtime journalism colleague, Randall Beck. I am the co-founder and co-chair of South Dakota News Watch. We are an independent, nonprofit news organization committed to reporting the most important statewide stories, from agriculture to education, from health to the environment, from public safety to politics. Our motto: inform, enlighten, illuminate. You can learn much more about South Dakota News Watch by going to our website, which is sdnewswatch.org. Again, that's sdnewswatch.org. Welcome, everyone. Whether you are logged into our Zoom webinar or you're watching a playback on Facebook or on YouTube, your support and enthusiasm for our critically important work, promoting a better informed, more engaged citizenry in South Dakota, is both appreciated and affirming. Newswatch is proud to launch its 2021 fundraising campaign today with a relevant, timely discussion about the presidential transition and what is ahead for our democratic society, our nation, and our state. Joining us today are two of the country's foremost professional journalists. First is USA Today Washington Bureau Chief Susan Page, who you may recognize because she was the moderator of the vice presidential debate on October 7th between Kamala Harris and Mike Pence. And next is the CEO and co-founder of Axios, Jim VandeHei, who previously was co-founder and CEO of Politico and was a Washington correspondent for the Washington Post and the Wall Street Journal. For those who are signed on to this as a live Zoom webinar, we ask that you use the chat feature to suggest questions for Susan Page and for Jim VandeHei. I will lead off this discussion, but then my co-chair, Randall Beck, will come in on the screen and he'll take over as moderator by posing your questions, selecting from your questions that you post in the chat. So let's get right to it. For Jim and Susan, what an extraordinary 4 years we've gone through. The last week I thought was unprecedented, and then today comes along and we have just one development after another. So let's get right to it and let's focus on the latest developments and where we may be headed rather than where we have been. Donald Trump has only 72 days left in his presidency, and although the president has yet to concede, Joe Biden, of course, has claimed victory and is moving on, planning for the transfer of power on January 20th. Both of you have written about this extensively. Susan, you had the lead story today in USA Today under the headline, "Joe Biden's Historic Victory will be followed by big problems and hard choices." Jim, you wrote on Axios, "Never before has a president-elect inherited a complex set of urgent and epic emergencies like the ones confronting Joe Biden and America." There was an op-ed piece just yesterday in USA Today. I want to reference that. It was written by Norm Ornstein under the headline, "What is next? The presidential transition from hell." So my question to both of you is whether or not Norm has overstated this situation, the seriousness of what we may be confronting here in the next 2+ months. Susan and Jim.
Well, Jack, just let me say first how honored I am to be here with you. I know that Jim feels the same way, and how important these projects like the South Dakota News Watch are in trying to maintain the kind of journalism that we need to have in this country. It's been a tough time for the news industry. Jim has been in the forefront of some of the ways people have tried to respond in innovative ways, like Axios. South Dakota News Watch, I know you're doing really crucial work making up for some of the cutbacks we've seen in local and statewide reporting. So, as an American, let me thank you for the work you do, and let me thank the people who are on this webinar who have made contributions to support your work. This is going to be a transition like no other, and in two ways. You have the Biden folks taking over a situation where they're going to do a U-turn on so many policies that the Trump administration has followed for the last 4 years. And the other way this transition is going to be different is we don't really know how President Trump's going to handle the next 72 days. He fired his defense secretary today. We don't know if there'll be more firings on the horizon even before he gets out of town. In fact, we don't even know that how voluntarily he'll leave town since he has not yet acknowledged that he lost the election. So this is, Jim and I have each covered a couple transitions. This is not going to be like the others.
Jim?
Yeah, I'd like to echo Susan's comments about the work that Jack and Randall do. Last time I saw Randall, we were in New York judging from our ivory tower some journalism projects and awards, and you're just lucky
for the Pulitzer Prize, I might add.
You're lucky to be in great hands, and I grew up in local journalism. I can't think of anything more important, and any project that requires like more public attention and any support that people can give to it. God bless you.
Well, thank you both for being part of this today.
Happy to do it. I'm with Susan. We've always been in uncharted waters with Trump, and I don't say that ideologically or from a partisan view. Like I think everyone would agree he's a very unpredictable, unconventional person who's not going to play by the norms, and I don't think he'll ever concede. Probably in his lifetime, I think he will forever say that this election was stolen, that he was a victim of media bias, of people saying the polls were something that they weren't to try to depress turnout, and I think 40% of the country, maybe a little bit more, will agree with him. And you see this already in the silence of so many elected Republicans. Very rarely in the past, when there's a contested election, do you have prominent members of a party refusing to congratulate the president-elect. And you have that. That's real. And this is going to get worse, probably not necessarily better. And so and you might think, transition, who cares? It just seems like, whenever one government comes in, another leaves. That period matters so much because government in some ways has been gutted, because we don't have necessarily the best and brightest in all the positions that you want them in. And so having an orderly transition, having people ready to roll in early January matters profoundly, because look what happened today. So you have Pfizer announces that they think they have a potential vaccine that had 90% efficacy for its control group. If that's right, and let's pray it is, you need to distribute that. You need to somehow come up with hundreds of millions of doses. And you have to create this complex infrastructure to be able to get that out to the public as fast and efficiently as humanly possible, so that you can start to defeat the virus and all of us can return to normal. That requires good government. That requires, honestly, like good cooperation between a lot of the departments that are doing the work now, and that then we'll be doing it for Joe Biden. And so this stuff really matters. And if you're Biden, it's like, great, I won. I've wanted, I've been wanting this for 50 years. Well, congratulations. Here's what you get. You get a debt bigger than anything we ever thought was possible. You have a super divided nation. You have a pandemic. You have economic devastation that's not picked up in these stock market numbers. If you look at long-term, people have just given up hope on trying to find a job. Long-term unemployment, the number's really high, and it's sort of dangerously high. So we inherit that. You inherit a China that feels like it's on the move and ready to sort of eat our lunch in terms of being the global superpower. Then you have climate. Like, there's just so many things. Any one of these, you'd say, oh my gosh, I'm going to spend my whole presidency and maybe I can tinker around the edges. You take 6 of them, God bless them, this would be a tough one.
So if the president continues to be non-cooperative during this transition period, could this do not only short-term damage to the democracy, but long-term enduring damage to the democracy?
Well, I do think the degree to which he refuses to say that Joe Biden is a legitimately elected president will be harmful to the Biden administration from day one to the end of that administration, and damaging to kind of the fundamental expectations of our democracy, which is that we have an election. It can be hard fought. People can feel very strongly on one side or the other. but when it's over, we unite at least for a time behind the legitimately elected leader of our country. If that doesn't happen this time, I think that has kind of repercussions that we have never experienced before. You know, it's funny. I mean, it's not funny, but in 2000, we of course had a disputed election, much closer than this election, and decided along in a much more controversial way by a 5-4 Supreme Court decision. And yet, when that Supreme Court decision came down after more than a month after Election Day, Al Gore conceded quite graciously to George W. Bush, and Democrats didn't like the outcome, but they accepted the outcome and united, at least for a time, behind George W. Bush as the president. If that doesn't happen this time, how in the world is Joe Biden going to be able to govern through these very difficult times?
I'll give you a reason to smile and then a reason to feel shocked. To smile, think about it. Like we just had a record number of Americans vote during a pandemic. They did it peacefully. There was almost no protests. There was almost no disruptions. All the things that we feared and talked about privately, most of them didn't happen. State officials rose to the moment. The elections appear to have been run almost as flawlessly as they can, given the cockamamie way we elect people in some of these states. The protests, we had people celebrating in the streets after Biden won. Very little violence, very little damage that I can tell. Like all the things that I would have worried about didn't materialize. People, the American people, put aside media, put aside some of the stuff happening on Twitter, behaved quite well. The thing that's going to shock you is like, I don't find, one of the interesting things, and I'm curious if Susan agrees, about covering Trump, and she spent time with him, we spent a lot of time with him. I find him to be the most predictable person I've ever met in my life when it comes to politics. I feel like I can tell you exactly what's going to happen. He's not going to, you're not going to have to pull him out of the White House. He cares too much about optics. He's going to say that the election was stolen. He's not going to show up for Biden's, initial speech to the country. He's going to probably, maybe within weeks, announce that he's running in 2024. He might not actually run, but he's going to do it. He's going to set up an apparatus outside of the White House. He'll spend some time at Trump Hotel, some time at Mar-a-Lago, sometime in Virginia, sometime in New Jersey. He's going to constantly be just messing with Trump and messing with Republicans on Twitter, probably anywhere from 10 to 20 times a day, often starting early in the morning, sometimes ending at 2 in the morning. He's going to have enormous sway over the Republican Party. He might be able to handpick who gets to run in House and Senate campaigns, how Republicans fight against Joe Biden, the posture that they take. His sway over the party, listen, he was running for re-election in about as bad a situation as you possibly could, a pandemic that he didn't do as much as he probably should have to be able to conquer it, bad economy, had all kinds of, himself getting the coronavirus, said all kinds of things that offended all kinds of people. And he still almost won and appears to have done better with Hispanics than maybe any candidate in the last 60 years for Republicans. So his sway with the party is not going to be diminished. And the idea that he's just going to go play golf or retire is crazy. There's no way. The guy's so addicted to fame and your attention, my attention, he'll never give that up ever. And so he's going to constantly be part of our lives.
Susan, you concur with that?
So he is predictable in many ways, and yet we continue to misunderstand him. And that's why we continue, I think, many of us to be surprised by him. Just your point about the strength he showed among Latino voters. I don't think that there had been some people warning the Biden folks that they weren't doing enough, but I don't think we foresaw how well he would do Latino voters, that he would get more votes than anybody in the history of American politics except for Joe Biden, that he would get a higher percentage of the vote than he did when he was the outsider candidate with no record to run on in 2016, that at a time when the number of Americans with COVID-19 was approaching 10 million, he would still have run a competitive race. I think is surprising to those who watch him. I totally agree he's not leaving the scene and will be hectoring President Biden and complicating the lives of every Republican. The only thing you said that I'm not sure I agree with is, do you think he will not show up for the inaugural ceremony? Because I'm of kind of two minds about whether he would feel that somehow it did him some good to be there, or it will be seen as so extraordinarily inappropriate if he refuses to show up. You think he won't be there?
He might, but I think he wouldn't. Again, like he's so again, I don't say this as an ideological statement. Like, I've never met anyone who thinks more about themselves and sort of how how they're going to utilize themselves and their fame for his own either profit or his own political gain. And even the things you said that surprised you, they weren't about him. They were about voters. I think all of us were shocked that if you look at the turnout he had, it appears, with suburban women. No poll saw that happening. There are counties in southern Texas. This is a true stat. Like southern Texas, places where Trump lost by 35 or 40 points and they're 97% Hispanic, and he won them. Nobody saw that coming, and that wasn't necessarily like we missed something with him. It's almost we missed the reaction to him, and that's where, like, me being in the media, Susan being in the media, like, we have to be humbled. Like, something is happening. Like, there's so many people that find him so much more appealing that anybody in the big cities and often in big media fail to appreciate. I remember spending my summer, I spent a lot of it in rural Maine and in rural Wisconsin, probably see a lot of it in South Dakota. I've never seen so many people take money out of their own pocket and paint a president's name on their boat or their truck or their house, or to come up with a flag that's bigger than the American flag that they would fly in front of their lake house. Like, something was happening out there where he became almost a fashion statement, an identity statement, a cultural statement that we should have been able to pick up on more perceptibly, and collectively we didn't, and polls missed it in some states like Wisconsin terribly, and others in meaningfully.
Well, Trump got, what, 8 million more votes this year than 4 years ago? And that's with a pandemic, with a financial collapse, with societal divides, with and plus all these controversies swirling around him for the last 4 years. So Joe Biden's task of trying to unify this country, what can President-elect Biden do in a substantive way to demonstrate to the 71 million voters for Trump? What can he do to demonstrate to those 71 million voters that he, Joseph Biden, is their president also?
Well, he can display the kind of rhetoric he has displayed since election night, which has been pretty measured and welcoming. I mean, we had one statement from a press spokesman for his campaign that was a little edgy, talking about taking trespassers out of the White House. That was the only time we've heard that kind of rhetoric coming from the Biden camp. I think that's a first step. But I think you have to, Jim was talking about how this electorate has surprised us for the past 4 years. One thing to remember is Trump didn't create this situation. Trump didn't create this political landscape. He recognized it. He exploited it. He figured it out. He walked through the door. But the landscape was already there and continues to be there regardless of what he does next. And so maybe the larger task for President Biden is to kind of figure out what's going on to make so many Americans unhappy. I'm not sure you can do it with a speech or with a COVID relief bill or I'm not sure there's something you can do that would persuade those Americans that they should be invested in him and his success. But I think that is the kind of, along with controlling the virus, which is job one, that is the essential task of this new administration.
I often wonder, I wonder a little bit, I don't think Biden would ever say this publicly. I wonder if part of him doesn't mind the election results. He knew if he had won big House majority, big Senate majority, he's so out of step with the woke left. You could tell every time he tries to talk like he's really liberal or he's part of the hip new progressive wing of the party. That's when he would stutter the most, or when he would trip over his words the most, because he's just not comfortable there. And had they had a massive victory, I think his whole presidency would have been bedeviled by that dynamic. And now he can say, listen, the American public said they don't want you to talk about defunding the police. They don't want you talking about open borders. We have to govern differently. And so in some ways, he comes into the presidency because of the results, in some ways better accommodated to govern the way I actually think he wants to. Like, I always think about him in terms of, like, he's 78. Like, I think about my parents, they're the same age. they're not going to change. They got their comfort foods and they're going to eat their comfort foods. His comfort food is sitting in a back room doing a deal with Mitch McConnell. It's giving a speech on budget reconciliation. It's not marching in the streets and talking about defunding the police. It's just not who he is. And so I think that in some ways the dynamic could work for him. And it's funny how history works, right? Like and Susan's written a lot about the presidency and sort of taking a look at it more broadly. But sometimes like there's a certain person will come along that in most contexts might not be a good candidate at all and might not be a great president, but all of a sudden circumstances make them what they work to them, they sort of bend to them. And like in some ways, like Joe Biden is kind of the right person right now in terms of the Democrat to run the country, because I do think he understands intuitively some of the grievance that 50% of the country feels. And I think he knows that the country's not ready to move as far as his party wants to move. And so the question will be is like in a Washington that's almost impossible to govern in divided government, can he get enough stuff done to have an appreciable effect on the country? And he might be able to. I think it'll be a really interesting dynamic, especially because he and McConnell at a personal level do get along.
Well, you wrote in a piece that came out yesterday, Jim, you wrote, Biden's reality is a rising left in the Democratic Party that will constantly pressure him, a Republican majority in the Senate that will constantly constrain him, and a reality of a rattled world that will constantly haunt him. So my question to both of you is, how does Joseph Biden build a coalition? How does he bring about collaboration under these circumstances?
First, let me just disagree with Jim, who I respect so much and would disagree with at my peril. But I'm pretty sure Joe Biden was not delighted or happy, relieved when Democrats did so poorly in those congressional races. If he had won bigger majority in the House and taken over the Senate, sure, there would be pressures from the Democratic left, but that would be what Bill Clinton used to call a high-class problem. That would be a problem I think he would be glad to have. Joe Biden is the first new Democratic president to come in without controlling both houses of Congress since 1884. It is a sign that he didn't have coattails. It's a sign that the impulses that elected Biden did not bring along his party. And I think it's going to make it hard for him to get just about anything through Congress. I know that Mitch McConnell was elected to his first term in 1984 when Joe Biden was the same year Joe Biden was elected to his third term. They've known each other since then. During the Obama administration, when the budget, there was great problems getting a budget deal and avoiding a government default, it was Joe Biden and Mitch McConnell who negotiated it. And yet today you heard Mitch McConnell take a Trumpian line against Joe Biden, refused to acknowledge that there was anything wrong with Trump contesting these states where he's way far behind and with no evidence of significant voter fraud. So I think that is a really sobering sign for even the most basic tasks like getting the cabinet confirmed that you want to have, much less passing significant pieces of legislation.
Well, do you believe that the Republicans are going to let Joe Biden have his cabinet?
Well, I think McConnell's we've already done a piece on this. He's going to put pressure on him to make sure that there aren't people. He's going to make it clear that they would try to kill anybody that they consider to be too liberal, or even put pressure on them to try to get you can only do so much, but try to get a cabinet that doesn't scare the hell out of Mitch McConnell. I think, Susan, I'm being a little bit facetious when I say this. He really mined it, but I think in terms of the way that he naturally wants to govern and the way he intuitively governs, he's so out of step with the woke left. And I think that is, that dynamic won't go away. That still persists. To your question about in some ways, I totally agree with everything Susan said about the dynamic and the difficulty. When I think about the difficulty, it's funny because I started Politico, right? And so it's going to be crazy that I say this. I think people spend way, way, way too much time thinking about politics. I really do. It's crazy. And I know you're to blame, whatever. But back when we started Politico, I don't think people spend enough time thinking about politics. So maybe we are to blame. And the reason I say that is the reality. So you got to step back, put aside this election and think about this moment. If you were looking down as an alien at our planet, you said, okay, what are the things that you have to solve, you as America? There's some big problems that have nothing to do with politics, right? So let's think of it. So one, the planet's warming. I'm sorry, you can't have 20 out of your 21 warmest years in the history of the planet happen in the last 21. So 20 of the 21 warmest have happened. It's happening. Right? There's almost no credible scientist who's looked at it and not said, this is an issue. We can debate like the solutions, but like it's real, and it's obviously having an effect, at least some effects, sometimes with storms and definitely with coastal living areas. It's a big, big, big problem. Then you think about technology. Trump wasn't just like didn't come out of nowhere. One of the reasons you have Trump is because of technology. We as a nation have spent no time thinking about what happens when you hook your head up to a cell phone and you just sit there for 8 to 12 hours a day, and you sit there and you click, 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 and you spend all your time on Facebook and all your time on Snapchat and all your time on all these platforms. Does it do anything to you? Does it do anything to society? Well, sure it does. You can tell it polarizes. I think in some areas it makes people dumber. I think it makes people more distracted. But we as a society have done nothing. Literally since the creation of these technologies, we haven't done anything. There's no new rules put around them. Anything that they do now is self-regulation. So that's a massive topic. And then whether you like China, hate China, think that they're a threat, not a threat. I'm sorry, go look at the size of their GDP compared to ours. Go look at their 2025 plan. They've written it, they've put it out there, read it. What does it say? I'm going to eat America's lunch militarily, diplomatically, economically, and I'm going to do that in the next 10 years. Okay, well, they seem like they're actually following through on that. So you've got these epic challenges sitting around you. And that context is even, to me, scarier than can I negotiate with Mitch McConnell, because if you don't get those other pieces right, it's going to be really hard for anyone to govern or for us to continue to be the best country on earth, which we are and which we should be forever. But if you don't get those pieces right, it's tough.
Well, let's dive into a few specific issues, and let's start right off with China. What could China do to make the most of America's current state of affairs over the next 2 to 4 years? You know, what could they do to take advantage of us as a competitor?
Well, one thing they can do is something they've been doing, which is building alliances elsewhere, ignoring the United States in a way, building alliances that will serve their long-term interests at a time we've let our traditional alliances fray. This will be a different, Joe Biden will come in to take over a different world than the one he left when he left the vice presidency 4 years ago. That is one way we see China moving already and effectively. President Trump has blamed China for the coronavirus, and of course it did start there to devastating impact. But China has more effectively responded in a global way to the coronavirus than we have, a more helpful way to other countries. So there's an example. Jim, I bet you have more.
Yeah, we'll play a game that I play, and my wife thinks I'm crazy, but then I'm dark, right? So I think about all the time, like, what would I do if I were someone wanting to mess with our country? Well, you do what China's doing, right? Like, it's so easy to play with our mind. So if I wanted to mess with America, what would I do? I would create a lot of bots on Twitter and on Facebook, and I would create some fake accounts, some real accounts, and I would just figure out what are the 2 or 3 things that all of us are arguing about, and I would find ways to make sure that I get that content to surge and pulse through those platforms. And that's what the Russians do, that's what the Chinese do, it's what the Koreans do, it's what the Iranians do. So I'd continue to do a lot of that. I would do what Susan's talking about, basically whatever. I'm like autocratic regime. I can do whatever the hell I want with my money. So I would go find all those emerging markets and I would create infrastructure relationships with them. I'd create pipelines and I'd create technology pipelines with them. It's called, they do it. They spent like literally trillions of dollars doing it over the last couple of years. I'd see that we have unstable relationships right now with the Germans. I'd go spend a lot of time with the Germans and see if I can't little by little start to pull them into my camp. And then I would play the ace card. The single biggest thing that is going to determine who has world dominance over the next 10 years, next 20 years, is going to be who wins the technology wars. I'm sorry, like once you put data, once you master algorithms and data, you can be smarter than we are as a species. Look at Google. Why does Google know, even once you type in 2 letters, what exactly you're going to type in and then give you the best possible search results within 1 second? Because their machines are unbelievable and they have so many inputs from billions of people. So why does China have an advantage? Because they have a lot more people than we do. If you have 4 or 5x number of people that we have, and you don't care about privacy and you don't care about your population, you can figure out the ways to manipulate that data and manipulate machines to be so much more effective than anything that we can create. And so when you hear this idea of decoupling, and I don't mean to get too in the weeds, but decoupling is this idea is, could you end up with basically 2 worlds, like 2 virtual worlds, one controlled by America and its allies, one controlled by China and its allies in terms of the technological infrastructure on which all of us live. That's a little bit scary because they might be able to do that at a scale that we can't, and that would give them real advantages in warfare. Like the next big war is going to be fought in space coming down. It's going to be fought through cyber warfare. It's not going to be a bunch of boots on the ground. Those days are over, and that's where technology really matters. So they could do all those things, and they are doing all those things. That doesn't mean that we can't defeat them. We have so many built-in advantages. I think we have more creativity. I think other countries, even when we're at our worst, consider us the best and want to root for us and want to be on our team. But there's nothing written into the global constitution that lasts forever. It's like a precious thing that we all have to continue to grow.
Let's transition to defense and security. Defense Secretary Mark Esper fired this afternoon by the president. Really an unprecedented move for a defeated incumbent to do that after an election. Were you surprised by that? What's the significance of that? And should we be concerned that there is now truly an undermining of the stability of our national security as a result of this change?
Well, it was not a surprise. Mark Esper had been kind of at odds with the White House for some time, unwilling to do some of the things that the president expected him to do as a matter of loyalty. He departs with some really remarkable criticism of the president and a warning that his fear has been that he would leave and be replaced by a yes man. And the suggestion that is about to happen in these final months of this administration. The president is in a different situation politically, having been defeated for re-election, even though he's still in office, but he still has all the powers of the commander in chief. And so, yes, I think it's a concern to people, not for ideological reasons, but just for the desire for kind of steady leadership in a dangerous world.
We'll let you in on a little secret. He's going to do the same thing to the CIA director probably within the next week. He made it clear, like if he doesn't like somebody, he doesn't want him around, and he's going to utilize whatever power he has in the final 75 or 72 days, whatever he has left. And again, to get like in the nuts and bolts of government, like here's why, I don't know how many people on the call are Trump supporters, Trump voters. The thing that I always found most troubling, just like watching this stuff and being a little bit of a student of it, was the lack of interest in filling all of the seats of government with the most talented people possible. Like all of us should root for that. I don't care who's in office. You really do want really smart people at the FDA, really smart people at HHS, really smart people at the State Department, the Defense Department, because there's so many of these complexities, so many things that are going to hit us that like it just require like look at the superbug, look at the coronavirus. It just requires like so much knowledge about infrastructure, disease, relationships. You think of, and you can maybe don't like government, but you can't. There's no putting the genie back in the bottle. Like we're going to be an increasingly interconnected world. Like once we unleash technology, you don't undo it. So we're all going to be more interconnected. And so many of the problems then become global problems. Like take climate change, right? Every one of us could start growing tomatoes and corn in our backyard, and that's all we eat. We could ride bikes and shut off our lights and only use matches or whatever to be able to light our house. It's not going to do anything to defeat a warming Earth unless you get all other nations to do the same thing. If we're doing it in India and China, when more people are polluting the hell out of the Earth, you don't actually win that war. You need cooperation, and that doesn't mean that Trump's not wrong. He's not that wrong that the UN and NATO at different times can be sort of weak or could be feckless. But they're also necessary. You've got to have that. And so those two things go hand in hand. Those relationships with other people overseas, with super duper competent people in government. And so whether it's Trump administration, whether it's a Biden administration, it's something everyone should root for. I think the good news is that Biden, because he's been there before, probably did more preparatory work on the transition period than anybody that we've seen in the past, because he realizes that you want to hit the ground running. And so I do think you'll see some of that reverse, but it takes time. You've got to get people in many of the most powerful positions approved by what could be a Republican Senate.
Let's transition to the U.S. economy. I know the stock market is certainly only one and perhaps an insignificant measure of the state of our economy, but President Trump told us that a Biden election would result in a stock market crash, and today the Dow went up nearly 3%. Extraordinary. Now, maybe that was because of the Pfizer announcement on the efficacy of the vaccine. But are the two of you, are you bullish, or are you concerned about the future of the economy under a Biden administration?
Well, the one thing you can say, the market apparently wasn't unsettled by the idea that Joe Biden was going to become president, even if it was the vaccine
Right.
announcement that really sparked the rally we saw today. It just seems to me that this does not affect people in the lives they live. Most Americans, the financial pressures, the economic pressures that help lay the groundwork for a populist president, I don't think that gets affected by a rising stock market. We've got millions of Americans out of work. We've got people out of work who aren't going to be able to go back to the jobs they had before. We've seen this virus not only have an economic effect, but accelerate economic trends that were already making, changing the nature of work and the jobs that you could have and actually earn a kind of middle class living. So I think I'm not against the stock market going up. That's great. I just think it's irrelevant to the pressures that a lot of Americans feel when they're sitting at home trying to figure out whether they're going to get evicted or whether they have enough money to buy food, or what in the world is going to happen. When will their kids be able to go back to school? And when they do, how are they going to be able to go back to work?
Yep.
And one of the many ways that as a society we've lost our marbles is that we get so much emotional, we get jacked up so emotionally about what a bucket of stocks do on an exchange, and think that that's some kind of indicator. Like, the truth is, there is so much liquidity being pumped into our markets, not just by us, but by the Chinese, the Europeans. You basically have our Fed and the equivalent of the Feds in almost every big country just pumping money into the system, making it free to borrow money. And so, of course, stock market's going to go up, because every company is and every investor is just assuming there's going to be more stimulus. At some point, the bill's going to come in, and it's going to have real ramifications, I think, for all of us. But to Susan's point, like, you want to step back and be like, yes, if you have a 401k and you're an investor, that's great. Like, I want my portfolio to go up just like you'd want your portfolio to go up. That is different than whether or not we have economic stagnation for 95% of the country. That is different than, do we have more people creating more startups than ever before? No, we actually don't. We're now seeing a decrease in the number of startups in this country. That's a bad thing. This country, the beauty of this country, and I'm a reporter, but now I guess I consider myself more of an entrepreneur. It is so awesome that this country creates things like Google and Apple and all these beautiful technologies that, if used right, can be world changing. And you've got like that precious part of capitalism. We have to figure out a way to cultivate that and spread that. We need more creativity, more jobs, more ways to be able to transition people who might have made a career choice that worked 10 years ago that doesn't work today. Otherwise, you're going to continue to have great resentment, and then therefore you're going to have discord in your politics, because if you feel like, I don't know, that these rich people seem to be doing a lot better, but I don't feel any better than I did 20 years ago, that's always going to be the root of some level of political chaos. And so will Biden's policies be better? I don't know. My guess is he's going to spend next year doing a stimulus of some sort. He'll attack the coronavirus. They'll either do it in the transition period or do it early next year. He'll want it to be big. Listen, the lesson, remember, this is not the first time he's entered the presidency with a really bad economy that could have been an economic catastrophe. Remember, he did it when he was the partner to Barack Obama. The lesson he learned then was they felt they didn't spend enough, that you have to do everything in your power to spend as much as you can to get the economy rolling and to get job creation going before you try to do ideological things like a philosophical fight over healthcare. And so he knows that, and that will guide his thinking. I think to Susan's point, McConnell will then restrain some of that thinking. But one of the places where he does want to put money in that does help the market, does help jobs, and I do think gets Republicans on board, would be some level of spending on infrastructure, which is a topic that comes up a lot, but I actually think he'll be much more focused on that because he handled the infrastructure portfolio under Obama. And I think he knows that there's Republicans that like infrastructure because it's things that they can take home and say, look what I did for you in your own neighborhood.
I'd like to now bring in Randall Beck, bring him up on the screen. Randall is a fellow co-chair and co-founder of South Dakota Newswatch. Randall has been watching the questions in the chat for those of you who are watching this live as a Zoom webinar. So I'd ask Randall to pick out several of those questions to pose to Susan Page and Jim VandeHei.
Yeah. Thank you, Jack. I appreciate that. Let me jump right in. This question, I think, reflects our expectation out here on the Northern Plains that we should all get along. The question from Beth in Spearfish is that regardless of the tone in Washington, is there any evidence that you can see that perhaps a Biden administration may trickle down to sort of a better spirit of the Democrats and Republicans getting along in state houses and in places outside the Beltway? Do you see any possibility it'll have better traction out here than in DC?
I'd just like to say Spearfish is a great name for a town, and I wish I had done a story from there so I could have had.
So you could have that byline.
I think people live their lives and run their governments and states without paying sometimes that much attention to what's going on in Washington, even though we think we're the center of the universe. But I do think Washington can set a kind of example. And what it's set in the past couple of years is a pretty bad example when it comes to being able to talk to one another and being willing to listen to one another. I mean, even some of the things that are that seem maybe archaic, like people from different parties, different political parties on Capitol Hill being willing to have dinner together, or just kind of having normal human interactions that are not fraught with politics is something that I think is helpful on the margins and maybe sets an example that would have some effect across the country. Although I got to say, I'm from Kansas. I was born and raised in Kansas, and when I go back there, the politics is just as angry and polarized as it is here in Washington, where I live now.
Jim, tell us it's going to change.
Oh man, I would love to. I'm of two minds on this. Like, on one hand, I still do believe. I just told my kids this the other day. I was like, because they think the whole country's going nuts. But think about, like, in a given year, how many people do we touch on a regular enough basis to kind of know, like, we know them, family, friends, neighbors, coworkers. Let's say it's several hundred. I would say of like the several hundred people in your network, you would say of almost all of them, good person, would volunteers, like does the right thing, would be there for me if I called them, would help me shovel my driveway if they came by and saw that I needed it. So on the one hand, I still believe in the fundamental goodness of humanity. Mm-hmm. However, I worry, and I've worried for about a decade, just about like the polarization, the tribalization is so hard to undo, because so many steps that we made over the last 20 years, like literally, like we have physically moved away from people who don't share our ideological views. Like the difference between living in a city and not living in a city, it's kind of wild now, right? And there's almost no Republican mayors. There's almost no Republicans that want to live in a city and they want to get as far away from liberals as they possibly can, and vice versa. And then you have this massive, massive distortion, reality corrupting device of social media, right? We're like, what moves the needle? How do you get fans? How do you get friends? How do you get that little dopamine hit that everyone thinks you're so damn smart? By saying crazy things. There's no market on social media for sanity. There's no market for like the sober-minded debate about the nuances of a bill. There's nothing. That stuff goes nowhere. It's all the visceral stuff, which has like such a powerfully polarizing dimension to it. And it makes it even seem often more polarizing than it is. But if you look every day at what moves the needle, what are the pieces of content that get the most interaction on Facebook, which is the most powerful company in the history of our galaxy, and it's not even close. They touch literally billions of people with their content each and every day. It's all hyper polarizing content. Most of it, by the way, on the conservative side, just because the conservatives have utilized it more effectively than liberals in terms of politics. But those things, Randall, are just so hard to undo. And it's why you don't really have that many moderates left in Congress on either side, particularly in the Republican Party. But you've seen it. We've all talked about it. The Southern Democrat that used to exist that for the most part doesn't, or the Northeast moderate Republican. Like when I got into this game, there were all kinds of them. They actually existed, the Lunch Bunch and the Tuesday Group and the New Dems and the Blue Dogs. Like that was the whole game. Well, they're gone. Now it's just my team versus your team. And then you see it. Why does Mitch McConnell or McCarthy, the House leader, refuse to say that Biden is the president-elect? Because it's not about what's really happening. It's about like, whose team are you really going to show that you're on? And the only way I can think that you change that, it really is like stubborn presidential leadership. The power of the presidency is still really, really, really immense. And if you had somebody who stuck to it, and I felt like both Obama and Bush, like I felt like both of them came into office truly believing that they wanted to change the tone. Remember, George W. Bush, the first version was compassionate conservatism. Barack Obama, I think, got 60% of independents. Like he had 60% favorable coming in, and said both wanted to change the tone of Washington. But then the forces are so powerful that within about 8 or 9 months of their presidency, they say, to hell with it, I'm going to become totally ideological, and both did. And so you'd have to have somebody who can withstand that temptation, that force, that really tries to just like do the hard work for 4 or 8 years to try to just a little bit turn the country in a different direction. And so far that hasn't happened.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks, Susan. So we have room for one more question, and it seems appropriate tonight that we would end it with a question about the press. So Norm and Melanie from Sioux Falls ask, what's the role of the press in all of this? And in their words, either amplifying or toning down sort of the polarization that we keep referring to this evening? Or is there a role, or is that the press's responsibility? So Susan, tee us up.
I think the press has some responsibility, some blame to bear for some of the problems we see going on in the government, and some of the erosion of trust in the news media as an institution. I find that very worrisome. It is something I think that we struggle with and try to think about. And President Trump, who has tested so many boundaries, has tested this in us as well. It took us a while, I think, to figure out what the right thing to do in covering a candidate like no other candidate, who said so many things that were factually inaccurate. And so one of the things that we've done is really beefed up our fact-checking operations, all of us, and tried to think through what our obligation is if the president of the United States, a figure of great regard and should be treated with the respect his office deserves, says things that we know are untrue and that his followers are believing. And we've worked on things like not even in the space of a headline or a tweet, don't let a lie go unchallenged. Don't let an inaccuracy go unchallenged. That's one of the ways in which we've responded. But of course, with the erosion of trust in the news media, there are a lot of people who simply don't believe us when we do fact checks that say the president said something that's inaccurate, or perhaps they don't care. It's not they don't think it's important enough to affect their decision on whether they believe in the president or will vote for him for re-election. and just one other way in which I think that we are trying to improve the way we serve our readers and viewers and play the role that we need to play in our democracy is to think about who is a journalist. And, you know, this involves one of those big trends of recent days that we haven't really talked about tonight, which is kind of the revival of the racial reckoning that we see, the revival of the debate about how fair our society is and what are some of the systemic problems that have affected people of color. And one of the ways we're responding to that is to try to get more journalists who are people of color. And that's something that's also important and affects the way we cover things. It's easy to blame the press, often fair to blame the press.
Yeah.
But I guess I continue to feel like the press is such a crucial part of making our democracy work. So we need to work on doing it better. And we need Americans to develop more trust that they can count on us to tell them the truth, whatever their political persuasion.
Thank you, Susan. Jim, I'm going to give you 2
Oh my
minutes.
God, I could
baby.
do an hour on this topic. I have such tortured views on it. On the one hand, like I guess the media should be more humble about its accomplishments and much more self-aware of its warts, I guess is the way I'd say it. Like, I think there's more good journalism taking place than ever before. I think a lot of the big institutions are doing some phenomenal work, really important accountability work, really clever new business models, washing away a lot of the garbage that sort of existed 5 years ago when people were just trying to get as much audience doing dumb things. And a lot of that has been corrected. So like on the one hand, some really good content. On the other, I think we deserve a lot of blame for where we're at, because you can't extricate media from politics. They're almost the same thing. Like one doesn't exist without the other in many respects. And I've said this before, I'll believe it, I think now forever. Twitter might have destroyed journalism, or a good piece of it. My colleagues, to this day, even today, like nothing gets me more worked up. I try to stay off of Twitter as much as I can. But when I go on there and I see all these reporters from the New York Times, the Washington Post, that I respect so much, making it so damn clear what their idea, who they're rooting for, who they're cheering for, tweeting disdainfully about 50% of America, and then thinking that they have some kind of superiority just because they work for big institutions that have done some really good work. One of the things that we do at Axios, we ban, even if you're a technologist, if you're an accountant, I don't care where you're working, you're not allowed to express your opinion in any public forum, which keeps some people from working for us, and I don't care. But for the most part, people have really adhered to that. And the reason that we did that was we said, listen, like there's people out there who are persuadable. We have to do everything in our power to get those people who've grown skeptical to be persuaded that we're trying to get to the closest approximation of the truth. Because if we keep speaking to the same audience or to each other, that's not going to fix the problem. We've got to figure out what is it that turned 50% of the country against us. And some of it's not reasonable, some of it is. And how do we get into a fact-based conversation with them, supply them with news so that they can make better decisions? Because God help us if we end up in a world where we all sort of selectively only get around facts that make us feel warm and fuzzy, and we tune everything else out, and we assume that it's fake, and we assume that it's manipulated. That's a bad outcome for society. One of the beauties of democracy, one of the beauties of our capitalism is the transparency, is the fact that I can write and Susan can write about anything, no matter how controversial. No one's going to lock us up. No one's going to throw us into some kind of camp. No one's going to ban us from being able to express ourselves. That's a beautiful thing that most nations don't have. But like what's changed is this war on truth. And it used to be, if you asked me 3 years ago, if I'm like in a snobbish way, I'd be like, oh, whatever. It's not my brightest friends that are falling for this stuff. Now it's the smartest people in my life that don't believe truth. Yeah. And that's the part, like somehow, and I will say, I'll end it with that plug for you guys, because I think one of the cures for this is the closer you are to somebody's, like where they live, I think the better chance you have to create a trusting relationship with them. And so I know that's the work that you guys do, and God bless you for doing it. And I think people who can support it should support it, because you've got to get to a point where one, you can hold people accountable, but two, where you can just have this set of facts where you can just make better decisions in your neighborhood, your state, and ultimately for the country. And I think that's what local journalism at its very best has always done and continues to do today. So congratulations to you guys for the work that you're doing.
Jim VandeHei and Susan Page, we cannot thank you enough for your time, for your contributions, and for your support for South Dakota News Watch. We're in your debt, and we so appreciate you taking time out of your schedule. Everyone else on the call, I hope you'll stick with us for just a few minutes, because based on what Susan said and what Jim said, we'd like to just spend just a few minutes talking about South Dakota News Watch and why we think we are critical at this time in our democracy. I also want to thank my friend and colleague and co-chair Jack Marsh for moderating the first and the largest portion of the discussion tonight. It was remarkable, and I hope all of you found value. You know, bringing South Dakotans together to talk about important stuff, to understand our world and our state better, is really part of our mission at South Dakota News Watch. But it's just one part of our mission to help citizens remain engaged and informed people in this state. For almost 3 years now, South Dakota's only nonprofit news organization dedicated to reporting on statewide topics has served the public interest by focusing on the stories you just don't see reported anywhere else. You know, in that time, we have delivered more than 200 in-depth stories in partnership with all media in this state, from broadcast media to newspapers. While we are deeply proud of that record of public service, Jack and I and our board and our news team, and I'll talk about them in just a moment, are here to say that we cannot do it without you. When you become a financial supporter of South Dakota News Watch, you join us, you join our news team, Bart Fancook and Nick Lowry, in championing something increasingly precious in our democracy. You heard about it on the panel discussion, something precious and important to our democracy: independent journalism that probes complex topics fearlessly and fairly and completely. Bart Fancook is our content director. Nick Lowry is our staff reporter, and the two of them have produced, as I said, more than 200 stories over the past 3 cycles, reporting with relevance and immediacy, such as our stories this spring, breaking new ground on how Smithfield and Sioux Falls and the federal government failed to protect workers and were slow to respond to the COVID-19 outbreak in that facility, or our interviews this summer with experts who challenged directly the Attorney General's explanation of how he struck and killed a pedestrian on a South Dakota highway. Reporting that searches for solutions, such as our special report this summer on how small towns and rural health care have struggled to thrive and find hope in the pandemic. Reporting that captures the humanity of our state, like our stories earlier this year that examined the failures and lingering questions about the disappearance of a little girl from a Black Hills children's home. And finally, reporting with impact that really makes a difference in our lives, such as our year-long deep dive into the successes and the challenges of life on our Native American reservations. Today, we are formally kicking off our fall campaign to raise financial support that will keep our 2-member news team, Bart and Nick, focused on ferreting out the most pressing stories in South Dakota in 2021. At a time when so many newsrooms are hard-pressed because of their size just to cover what's happening that day in their communities, South Dakota News Watch is committed to tracking and producing and distributing complex stories on statewide topics, just like that Jack said earlier, from agriculture to education, from public safety to the environment, and of course, the continuing pandemic. Our campaign goal for 2021 is $250,000. That's a modest budget, we believe, for producing in-depth journalism that's delivered regularly through existing media in every corner of the state. We are funded exclusively at South Dakota News Watch by grants and by donations from people just like you. From now through December 31, because of a generous one-to-one challenge grant by Dan and Arlene Kirby and Newsmatch, which is a group of foundations supporting nonprofit journalism, you can double the impact of your tax-deductible gift. A gift of $250 automatically becomes $500. $1,000 becomes $2,000. My question, my challenge, Jack and I, to you is, will you join us in this important work that is so essential to our democracy? Will you help us maintain and even strengthen a free and vibrant press in the coming year? Whether you have supported our work from the very beginning, and many of you have, or whether this is your first exposure to South Dakota News Watch, we hope that you will consider a donation, a gift, and we will be deeply honored by it. Newswatch is grateful for every gift, but I want to call your attention tonight to really what we regard as the heart and soul of our donor base. An annual gift of $500 or more places you in what we call the First Amendment Society. It's a select group of folks who receive special benefits throughout the year, such as invitations to online events, just like the one that you've just finished listening to. First-time members this year will receive a beautiful set of mugs featuring two things, the 45 words of the First Amendment on one side and the South Dakota News Watch logo on the other. And this year, First Amendment Societies members who re-up will receive a set including a South Dakota News Watch mask and hand sanitizer. We would really love to have you on our team this year, and I know that Bart and Nick would really appreciate you helping support the work that they are doing. Here's how you can give. Please go to our website, sdnewswatch.org. You can see it behind me. You can see it on the screen. And you can click on the top where there is a donate button, and that right there will give you all of the information you need to send a check or a money order or to donate online. And while you're on our website, don't forget to sign up for our regular news alerts. That's your direct channel to our top quality journalism. That's sdnewswatch.org. And there is no time to do that like the present. So we thank you. In return for your donation and for your gift and for your support, we pledge to deliver in 2021 the very best journalism in South Dakota, investigative and public service work that sheds light on the issues and the concerns and the welfare of all South Dakotans, people just like you and me. Thank you again to our panelists, Jim and Susan, to Jack for their thoughtful analysis and perspective. And as you leave this call today, you may be prompted to take a brief survey. We would really be grateful if you would do that. That would help us as we plan future events. So on behalf of all of us at South Dakota News Watch, Jack, the board, Bart, and Nick, thank you and have a great evening. Good night.